Night of Tears, Dran or Selet. Saarthal holds a prominent place in Skyrim's history, even if most do not remember it by name. It is of course the site of one of the first major Nord settlements, one of the first cities of men in Skyrim, and the earliest known capital of their civilization. It was also the site of terrible bloodshed, when the elves attempted to drive the Nords out of Skyrim to succeed only in incurring their wrath in the form of Ysgramor and his fabled 500 companions, who swept the elves from Skyrim and firmly established it as the home of the Nords. All this is known, but little else. What happened on that Night of Tears, when Saarthal was razed to the ground? What provoked the elves to such a deliberate, vicious attack, and what prompted such a severe response from the Nords? Vingalmo's treatise on the Altmer antecedent suggests that the elves of the Meritic era, along with their counterparts, the early Dwemer, possessed a degree of sophistication unparalleled in Tamriel. They displayed power beyond what could be expected of the time. While a distinct explanation is not given for this, I believe that this work, compared with the early writings of Hesef Kirirnis, suggests that something greater was at work on that night in Saarthal. The true motives behind the Night of Tears have been obscured to us by the passage of time, but I believe this was not a simple war of territory or of control of Skyrim. I believe that what happened was a significant event based around something very particular. The Nords found something when they built their city, buried deep in the ground. They attempted to keep it buried, but the elves learned of it and coveted it for themselves. Thus they assaulted Saarthal, their goal not to drive the Nords out, but to secure this power for themselves. I believe Ysgramor knew something of what the elves would find under Saarthal, and rallied together his people to keep the elves from gaining it. When Nords once again controlled Skyrim, this power was buried deep below the earth and sealed away. Time has kept this knowledge from us, but it is my hope that time will also reveal the truth of these words. Every effort will be made to relocate Saarthal and find that which has been lost to us. On Artaeum, by Torsil Anselma. The Isle of Artaeum, is the third largest island in the Somerset archipelago, located south of the Moridunon village of Potanza and west of the mainland village of Runcibe. It is best known for being home to the Psijic order, perhaps the oldest monastic group in Tamriel. The earliest written record of Psijics is from the 20th year of the First Era and tells the tale of the renowned Breton sage and author Vornet traveling to the Isle of Artaeum to meet with Iakesis, the right master of the Psijics. Even then, the Psijics were the counselors of kings and proponents of the Elder Way taught to them by the original race that inhabited Tamriel. The Elder Way is a philosophy of meditation and study said to bind the forces of nature to the individual will. It differs from Magicka in origin, but the effects are much the same. That said, it is perhaps more than coincidence that the Isle of Artaeum literally vanished from the shores of Somerset at the beginning of the Second Era, at about the time of the founding of the Mages Guild in Tamriel. Various historians and scholars have published theories about this, but perhaps none but Iakesis and his own could shed light on the matter. 500 years passed and Artaeum returned. The Psijics on the isle consisted of persons, mostly elves, who had disappeared and were presumed dead in the Second Era. They could not or would not offer any explanation for Artaeum's whereabouts during that time, or the fate of Iakesis and the original council of Artaeum. Currently, the Psijics are led by the lore master Celarus, who has presided over the Council of Artaeum for the last 250 years. The council's influence in Tamrielic politics is tidal. The kings of Somerset, particularly those in Moridunon, have often sought the Psijic's opinion. Emperor Uriel V was much influenced by the council in the early, most glorious part of his reign, before his disastrous attack on Akavir. It has even been suggested that the fleet of King Orgum of Pyandania was destroyed by a joint effort of Emperor Antiochus and the Psijic Order. The last 4 emperors, Uriel VI, Morihata, Pelagius IV, and Uriel VII, have been suspicious of the Psijics enough to refuse ambassadors from the Isle of Artaeum within the imperial city. The Isle of Artaeum is difficult to chart geographically. It is said that it shifts continuously, either at random or by decree of the council. Visitors to the island are so rare as to be almost unheard of. Anyone desirous of a meeting with a Psijic may find contacts in Potenza and Runcibe, as well as many of the kingdoms of Somerset. Were it more accessible, Artaeum would be a favorite destination for travelers. I have been to the isle once and still dream of its idyllic orchards and clear pastures, its still and silent lagoons, its misty woodlands, and the unique Psijic architecture that seems to be as natural as its surroundings, as well as wondrous in its own right. The Sephora Tower, in particular, I would study, for it is a relic from a civilization that predates the High Elves by several hundred years and is still used in certain rites by the Psijics. Perhaps one day I might return. Note: the author is currently on the Isle of Artaeum, by gracious consent of Master Sargesius of the Council of Artaeum. The Last King of the Ayleids, by Herminia Sina. The Ayleids, or Heartland High Elves, ruled Cyrodiil in the long ages of myth before the beginning of recorded history. One of the earliest recorded dates, in fact, is the fall of the White Gold Tower in the First Age of the year 243, which is commonly assumed to mark the end of the Ayleids. Although Ayleid rule over all of Cyrodiil was indeed broken in the First Age of 243, this was only one of the most obvious stages near the end of a long decline. The first 2 centuries of the First Era saw increasing strife between the great Ayleid lords of Cyrodiil. Alessia appears to have taken advantage of a period of civil war to launch her uprising. Imperial historians have traditionally attributed her victory to intervention from Skyrim, but it appears that she had at least as much help from rebel Ayleid lords during the siege of White Gold Tower. The most popular image of the Ayleids as brutal slave masters is based, in fact, of course, but it is less well known that a number of Ayleid princes continued to rule parts of Cyrodiil after 243 as vassals of the new Empress of Cyrodiil. This suggests either that Ayleid rule was not universally detested, or that Alessia and her successors were more pragmatic than is traditionally believed, or perhaps some of both. In any event, excavations at a number of Ayleid sites show continued occupation and even expansion during the so-called Late Ayleid period, First Age 243 till 498. At first, many Ayleid lords continued to rule as vassals of the new human regime. In some cases, Ayleid supporters of Alessia were even rewarded with new lands taken from slain enemies. It is not clear to what extent human slavery continued under the Cyrodiilic Empire. Humans continued to dwell in the Ayleid-ruled areas of Cyrodiil, but there is nothing definitive to show under what terms. This is an easy relationship from the beginning, and was not destined to last long. Resentment at the continued presence of Ayleid nobles within the empire was a contributing factor to the rise of the so-called Alessian order, founded by Maruk. The first victims of the Alessians were the Ayleids of Cyrodiil. In the early 300s, the surviving Ayleid communities in human-ruled areas were obliterated one by one, the refugees temporarily swelling the power of the remaining Ayleid lordships. Then, in 361, the Alessians gained control of the empire and enforced the Alessians' doctrines throughout its domain. The Ayleid lordships were abolished. Enforcement of this decree does not appear to have required much direct violence. It seems that by this point the balance of power was so overwhelmingly against them and their fate so long foreshadowed that most of the remaining Ayleids simply left Cyrodiil, eventually being absorbed into the elven populations of Valenwood and High Rock. Indeed, the rise of the Durrani hegemony may be linked to this exodus of Ayleids from Cyrodiil, a connection so far little studied by historians. Still, a remnant Ayleid population seems to have survived the rule of the Alessians, because we hear of the last king of the Ayleids, joining the Battle of Glenumbria Moors, where the Durenis decisively defeated the Alessians in 482. How these king's people survived the preceding century is unknown. We do not even know who they were, although recent research points to Nenalata as the possible resting place of this last king. Unfortunately, in the current state of the empire, funds are no longer available for proper scientific investigation of such extensive ruins, so the answer to these questions will have to be left to future generations.